If you have a green card application sitting inside the United States right now, or you are planning to file one, the rules just changed in a way that could decide whether you are approved or denied. I want to walk you through exactly what happened, what it means for your case, and what you should do about it. On May 21st, 2026, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services issued a policy memorandum called PM-602-0199. The headlines around it are frightening. Some made it out to sound like adjustment of status was being abolished. It was not, but the truth is more nuanced and frankly more important than the headlines, because this affects how an officer decides your case at the most critical stage. I'm your instructor with the Botelho Immigration Courses. I'm Attorney Joseph Botelho, and this is the same lesson we teach inside our courses, broken down step by step so you can actually understand the mechanics, not just the headlines. Stick with me to the end because I'm going to tell you about 4 documents we're giving away with this video, including a copy of the actual government memo that you can download from the links in the description and use to prepare your case. Let's start with what the memo literally says, because the exact words matter. The subject line of the memo is long, but it tells you everything. Adjustment of status is a matter of discretion and administrative grace, and an extraordinary relief that permits applicants to dispense with the ordinary consular visa process. Read that carefully. USCIS is saying 3 things. Number 1, adjustment of status is discretionary. It's not automatic. Number 2, it's an act of administrative grace. And number 3, it's extraordinary relief because it lets you skip ordinary process of getting an immigrant visa at a U.S. consulate abroad and instead become a permanent resident without ever leaving the country. Here's the key legal point. USCIS did not invent a new rule. The memo leans on decades of case law, a 1974 decision called Matters of Blass, and Supreme Court language describing relief from removal and adjustment as a matter of grace, not right. What the memo does is take that long-standing principle and instruct officers to apply it more strictly, and in a way that favors sending people through the consulate abroad rather than approving them here. So the law itself, Section 245 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, has not changed. Your eligibility requirements have not changed. What changed is the lens the officers use at the very end, the discretionary judgment after they confirm that you're eligible. This is the single most important concept in the whole video, so let me make it concrete. There are 2 separate questions in any adjustment case. Question number 1, are you eligible? That's a checklist. Lawful entry, a visa available to you, admissibility, the right category. Question 2, should the officer exercise discretion in your favor? That's a judgment call. Before this memo, many applicants treated the I-485 like a form package. Meet the checklist, get approved. After this memo, meeting the checklist is the beginning, not the end. The officer is now explicitly told to ask, even though this person is eligible, is granting them a green card from inside the country the right outcome, or should they go through the consulate like the statute generally prefers? The memo says officers must weigh all positive and negative factors in the totality of the circumstances and decide whether you are suitable for permanent residence and whether approving you is in the best interest of the United States. Those are broad and subjective standards. That's why two people in the same visa category can now get two different outcomes. Now, after the memo dropped, there was a real panic, and USCIS and the Department of Homeland Security walked the tone back a little. Spokespeople told the press the policy would be applied case by case, and that applicants who present a clear economic benefit or national interest case and who kept a compliant employment-based status would likely be able to continue their current path. That's genuinely reassuring if you say an H-1B holder with a clean record and a strong employer, but I have to be straight with you. Those were statements to reporters. They are not a new memo, not a regulation, and not a withdrawal of PM-602-0199. Officers are still adjudicating under the memo. And we're already hearing about tougher, more pointed questioning at interviews. So do not treat the press statements as a safe harbor. The smart move is to assume the officer is applying the memo in full and to prepare accordingly. Hope for the softer interpretation, prepare for the strict one. Let's get practical. Who's most at risk and who's in a stronger position? The biggest dividing line is whether your visa allows what we call dual intent. Dual intent means you can lawfully hold a temporary status and intend to immigrate at the same time without the two conflicting. The two classic dual intent categories are H-1B and L-1, along with their dependents, H-4s and L-2s. For these folks, pursuing a green card does not contradict the terms of their admission. They start in the strongest position, lower to moderate risk. Then you have single intent categories, F1 students, including those on OPT and STEM OPT, B1 and B2 visitors, J1 exchange visitors, and TN professionals. These visas require non-immigrant intent. Filing for a green card soon after entering can look like you concealed your intent at entry, which raises misrepresentation concerns. Students are moderate to high risk. Visitors are high risk. TN, they're moderate to high risk. O1 sits in an awkward middle. It's not a statutory dual intent category, but historically it's been treated more flexibly. How the memo applies to O1 is genuinely unsettled right now. K1 fiancé visa holders are actually in a decent spot if the visa is used properly, because adjusting after marrying a U.S. citizen petitioner is exactly what the K1 was designed for. Immediate relatives of U.S. citizens are fact-dependent. Some status violations are forgiven, but discretion still applies. And EB-5 investors have a special statutory argument I'll come back to. At the very top of the risk ladder, anyone with an overstay, unauthorized employment, an arrest, or a prior misrepresentation. The memo tells officers that negative factors like these need to be offset by, and I'm quoting matter of blast here, unusual or even outstanding equities. That's a high bar. A few traps to avoid. First, even if you're in a dual intent category, the memo is explicit, and this is a direct point in the document, that maintaining a dual intent status is not sufficient on its own to warrant a favorable exercise of discretion. Dual intent removes a negative. It does not win the case by itself. You still need to build a positive side. Second, the so-called 90-day rule. Let me be blunt. It is not a rule. It was never a statute. It was a description of USCIS's past habit of not usually challenging a filing made at least 90 days after entry on a single intent visa. Nothing makes 90 days a magic safe number, and this memo makes planning around that mark riskier than ever. Please do not count to 90 days and assume you're safe. Treat timing as a legal question, not a calendar trick. Third, travel. If you have a pending I-485 and you're not in H-1B or L-1 status, you generally need an approved advance parole document before you leave the country. Otherwise, your application can be treated as abandoned. And if you've accrued unlawful presence, leaving can trigger a multi-year bar on you coming back. H-1B and L-1 holders generally can travel on their underlying status, which is one more advantage of those categories. So, how do you actually win on discretion? You build a record. The memo and existing USCIS guidance point to the factors officers weigh. On the positive side, a compliant immigration history and consistent maintenance of status, family ties in the U.S., length of residence and community connections, tax compliance and lawful employment, good moral character, think military service, community service, and humanitarian factors like serious medical conditions. On the negative side, immigration violations like overstays or unauthorized work, fraud or false testimony to any government agency, conduct inconsistent with the temporary purpose of your admission, criminal history, and anything that looks like an attempt to bypass the consular process or conceal immigrant intent at entry. Here's how I want you to think about your filing now. Build it in 2 layers. Layer 1 is the ordinary eligibility packet. The forms, the petition, the medical exam, the I-94, civil documents. Layer number 2 is the discretionary packet. And this is where most generic filings are weak. A short legal cover letter and immigration status timeline, proof of timely filings, tax record, evidence of family equities, community involvement, and a direct, honest explanation of any negative factor. One more crucial point straight from the memo. When an officer denies a case on discretion, they are required to issue a written denial that weighs the positives and negative factors and explain why the negatives won. That matters because it means a well-documented positive record isn't just persuasive. It forces the officer to grapple with it on paper. And there's a hopeful nuance. Long-standing USCIS guidance says that where there are genuinely no negative factors to weigh against you, denial is genuinely an inappropriate use of discretion. The memo even repeats that the absence of adverse factors by itself isn't an outstanding equity, but if your record is truly clean, you have a real argument. Document it fully. Do not assume it speaks for itself. The memo nudges people towards consular processing abroad, but, and I cannot stress this enough, leaving the country is not automatically the safer choice. For someone with unlawful presence or other inadmissibility issues, walking out the door to consular process can trigger the very bars that keep them out for years and separate them from families. So the decision between adjusting here or processing abroad has to be made on your specific facts. Work through it like this. Are you statutorily eligible? What was your status at entry, dual intent or single intent? How soon after entry are you filing? Are there negative factors? Are there strong positive factors? Would leaving create its own risks like the unlawful presence bars? And finally, can your I-485 be strengthened before you file with a brief and evidence package rather than just sent it on a bare form? That last question is usually where the real value is. In most cases, the answer isn't a simple file or don't file. It's file, but file strategically and fully documented. Two groups have arguments, most applicants don't. EB-5 investors, where Congress passed the EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act of 2022, it created a specific statute, INA Section 245N, that expressly allows the investor's adjustment application to be filed concurrently with or after the investor's petition where a visa is available. In other words, Congress deliberately built in-country filing route for EB-5s. That's the opposite of a disfavored workaround. And the economic benefit framing in the June clarification tends to help this group too. K-1 fiancé visa holders. Adjusting status after marrying a U.S. citizen petitioner is literally the purpose of the K-1 visa was built for. You can't extend a K-1, you can't switch to another status, and you must marry the petitioner within 90 days. So for a properly used K-1, adjusting here isn't conduct inconsistent with your admission. It's the plan working as designed. That's a strong answer to the memo's central concern. Neither argument is a guarantee. USCIS still reviews admissibility, the bona fides of a marriage, source of funds for EB-5, and discretion. But your meaningful starting advantages, and you should make them explicitly in your filing. Okay, here's what I promise you. To help you actually prepare, we're giving away 4 documents with this video, and you can download all of them from the links in the description below. First, our own client guide to the PM-602-0199 in plain English handout that turns everything in this video into a checklist you can work from. Second, third, and fourth, we're including 3 additional handouts that go deeper on specific pieces: the evidence and the discretionary packet builder, the adjustment versus consular decision worksheet, and the category by category risk breakdown. And critically, we're also giving you a copy of the actual government memo itself, the full text of PM-602-0199, so you can read the source, not just someone's summary of it. Go to the description, click on the links, and download all 4. They're free. And then put it to work. Everything in this video is general education. It is not legal advice about your specific case. If you want to go deeper, our courses walk through each of these steps in detail with templates and worked examples so you can prepare a genuinely strong, fully documented application. The link to enroll in Botelho Immigration Courses, along with our website and our full YouTube playlist of immigration updates, is in the description below. Do me a favor, subscribe to the channel and check our playlist, because U.S. immigration law is changing fast right now, and we're posting updates as USCIS issues new guidance and as the courts weigh in. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.